As a touring artist, as well as someone who's done behind-the-scenes video stuff at venues throughout the US, if you're going to be putting on concerts, here are some things your venue needs to provide. So I want to start off this venue by saying I know every place is a little different, and I've performed at a lot of different places. Everywhere from, small outdoor venues to libraries, to churches, to bars, to dedicated nice concert venues, to big, beautiful performing arts centers. I've seen a lot of stuff. So part of this is just a brainstorm, and I would love to see some of your ideas in the comments. This isn't to criticize, it's to educate, because every place is a little different, everyone's capabilities and goals are a little bit different. Maybe you are someplace that's a pre-existing venue and you're thinking about ways to streamline your setup and make things better, or maybe your dream has always been to have and run a venue and you need a little bit of an artist's perspective. That's what I'm here for. Now, a lot of this stems from the idea with me that really comes from my grandma, and that's to do everything as unto the Lord. Especially as someone who's from a Christian family and working in the leadership team for a church, we're always thinking about how can we do business right and how can we represent the kingdom well, doing things with excellence. Now, I want to put a side note here to artists. Artists have standards, but don't be a diva. Recognize what your goals are before you go to any given event. And if you're going through stuff that's unnecessary and you're dealing with stuff that you shouldn't have to deal with, draw the line somewhere and just don't go back and choose not to do business with them anymore. But also do recognize that sometimes you go into some events realizing that there's no pay involved or that the facilities aren't that great, and you're doing it because you love the people that are putting it on, you want to bless somebody, etc. Other times you're there to do business and everybody better have it together, and if they don't, it might reflect poorly. So use some wisdom there. So I've split up my list into two halves. The first half is essentials, things that if you're going to be putting on concerts and events, you should think about and have a plan for, period. The second half is ideals, stuff that everybody may not have access to right now. They might be things that you're moving toward, or maybe you never even thought about. So first, let's start with the essentials. The first thing on the essentials list is prompt and clear communication. Usually it helps to have a single point person that an artist is talking to leading up to the event. Remember, they might be planning a tour, so they could be talking to people at 20 plus other venues. So it helps if they're only talking to one person from your venue throughout the process. And it's huge that you respond to messages in a timely manner. If they're waiting weeks and months between when they hear from you again, don't expect for them to want to work with you anymore. Secondly is a clearly communicated pay policy, even if the artist doesn't ask. Now look, I get it. The artist should be asking about that, but even if they don't, go ahead and mention it up front, just so that there's no confusion through the process. Everybody does this a little different. For some people, they just go by whatever the artist's contract dictates and whatever performing rights organizations, blah, 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 they're working with. For other people, they have a set amount that they give to anybody that comes through the door. And even for others, it's based on how many pre-sales the artist sells. Now, of course, there are different opinions about these different methods, and of course, I have my own opinions about these different methods, and those can be debated, but just know what your policy is and state it up front. I have a side note here for churches, again, because I'm in a church leadership family and on the church leadership team. Churches, I would recommend that you do have at least a minimum floor of what you know you're for sure going to give everyone who comes through your door. I think that reflects well on the kingdom, and it just helps us do better business. Next up, and some people are going to think this is kind of an ask, but I think we're adult enough to handle it, and that is clean and accessible restrooms, preferably that are close to the staging area that can be easily accessed by the artists. Now don't get me wrong, I have changed in small, smelly, unclean restrooms that were far away from the staging area before, and I didn't complain. I get it, sometimes that's just the way the building is set up. But if at all possible, keep them clean and try to provide something for the artist that is close to where they're going to be. Then there's designated space for merchandise tables. Look, even if you're working in a small space, just having a corner with a table set aside for them can be a pretty big deal, because a lot of artists are selling CDs, t-shirts, merchandise, etc., and that helps support what they're doing. Remember, if you're going to be working with 2 or 3 artists, that's going to double or triple the space you want to have provided. And again, it helps if you provide a table for them. I know some artists sometimes have like a little fold-up table with them, but they're already thinking about a lot of other things and bringing a lot of other gear. So some of them don't have that at all. Next up is having a plan for getting gear into and out of the venue and where it's going to be stored while it's there. Depending on what you're working with, this may not be super pretty, but you should just know what the plan is so you can act on it and give people instructions when they show up. Then, this is an on-stage thing. Access to power at multiple points on the stage. It's really great if you can have power downstage, that's on the edge of the stage. My mom and I were looking at a venue recently that was being built, and we were like, you know, being that she runs my gear table, she knows a lot about this stuff too, and we were just kind of talking. We were like, it's great that they have power, but it's all along the back wall of the stage, which is pretty far from the front or downstage. And you have to think about, you know, guitarists have pedal boards, sometimes people will have keyboards up front or laptops that they're running, and it's much better if you can have power downstage. Now, if you don't have outlets built into the ground, just run some extension cables up around the front and have power strips and splitters. Now, a little note to the artists. Artists, every venue you go to may not have as much of this stuff as they honestly should. So it is a good idea to have your own power strips and extension cables with you. But venues, that's something you ought to have together, especially if you're asking the artist to provide their own sound system. If you don't have your own sound and production and you're bringing in one of those full service artists who brings their own PA and sound system as well, it's great if you can have a lot of outlets available to them. I know that in some of the setups I use, I can work with as little as 2 outlets and make it work, but I try to be the most prepared artist that I can, and not everybody always does that. Finally, have a plan for parking. Again, depending on what you're working with, this may not be ideal, it may not be pretty. It might be, okay, pull up behind the building to unload, but then you've got to go park around the block or whatever it might be. But just have a plan and be able to tell people exactly what it is ahead of time. Okay, so now moving on to the ideal list. This is stuff that everybody may not have access to right now, and that's okay, but it's great things to think about moving forward as we're thinking of ideas for places that we want to build or things we want to improve. First off is a staff to help artists with loading gear in and out. As a singer, I definitely appreciate that. You know, I'm a guy that likes to get in there and help get things done. I don't necessarily want to just schlep things off on other people. But there's a time and a place for delegating, and if I fatigue myself before I ever even get on the stage, my performance might suffer. It might suffer a lot if I've overworked myself. So if you can provide personnel to help the crew or the staff or the band if they're carrying their own stuff and doing their own load-in, if you can provide help, that's always going to be greatly appreciated. Along with this, it's great to have a green room or / dressing room, or even multiple green rooms and dressing rooms with things like a couch, maybe a fridge for artists to put their leftovers in, providing water, stuff like that. That is awesome, and that always helps out artists and their crews quite a lot. Because you have to think, if an artist is sitting out in the crowd listening to loud music all night before they ever even hit the stage, man, their ears might be fatigued, or they might, you know, just be a little bit stressed out from having to hide before people see them if they're like a bigger artist. So having a dressing room, a staging area for them can be super valuable. Another great ideal thing to provide is a meal, providing dinner. And remember, if you're working at higher levels, you already know this, that catering is part of some artists' contracts. Now, I know people have made big fat deals about this and posted that stuff online in recent years. Oh, look at what this artist is demanding. Dude, you need to chill. Like, that's a shopping list. That's a grocery list. And I don't even care if somebody is traveling around in a private jet or a big, beautiful fleet of tour buses. Traveling is still harder than just being at home, okay? So it's really not that exorbitant for artists to be requesting specific things. It's just a shopping list, and they're not out doing their own shopping right now. So that's pretty normal. Next up in the ideal category is an easy way to get stuff loaded into the venue / the backstage staging area. That might mean having large double doors throughout that entire corridor. It might mean having a loading bay where trucks can back in and pull up with something like a freight elevator. All that stuff is awesome. And that kind of dovetails into something that is then within the venue, which is an easy way to get that stuff on and off the stage. Again, maybe that is a ramp, maybe it's a freight elevator, but having just stairs to get gear on and off of the stage can be pretty challenging sometimes. Next up, and this, if you haven't been to a lot of venues, you may not know this, but this is not just a given. having a backstage or a staging area. You know, I've seen some stages that are great and that are well equipped, but there are no wings and there's no backstage whatsoever. And that can make some things, when they're bigger productions, pretty challenging, because you're forcing yourself to always, no matter what, have to backline all the time. And I've been in some really cool situations where we had a big, luxurious backstage area to work with, where we could, you know, have gear ready, set up to roll, production elements set up to roll in and out, rotate in and out, and that was awesome because you weren't sneaking around up against a wall if something went wrong. You know, you could still conceal when you were fixing a problem in the middle of a production, and that was very helpful. And that leads me to having a good sound system and someone who can competently run it. Look, I have seen artists who were very good made to sound really terrible by a guy or a girl at the front of the house who just didn't know how to mix them. Look, I know there's some purists out there who are going to say, well, if a band's good, they're going to sound good no matter what. Look, dude, you can take a guitarist whose tone could be big and massive, and you can mic their guitar cab wrong and EQ it poorly and just make them sound like a howling buzzsaw in the house. And that's not entirely their fault. Now look, I could probably make a separate video, guitarists, about ways to make your tone better for live and to prepare for that and make it kind of dummy proof, but we're talking next level stuff here, and it's always good to be able to competently run your own system. And having a lot of direct-in DI converters and capabilities is really great these days as well too. Talking about being able to receive direct XLR or 1/4 inch, maybe even 1/8 inch cables from artists who come in can be pretty critical now, because, you know, we have keyboardists, we have now bassists that can run direct, we have guitarists that might be running an Axe Effects or a Kemper modeler that has a direct input that they can just plug into your system, and it gives you a cleaner signal than if you're miking. And then you also have things like backing tracks or electronic drums or drum pads or K oscillators and things like that. So having a large amount, more than you think you need, of DIs can be pretty critical. And artists, this is something that you can keep a few of on hand as well, just to help out the venues you go to, but label your stuff. And that goes very perfectly into having clearly marked house equipment, or at the very least being able to identify by sight what stuff belongs to you so that people don't accidentally steal your gear and then you have an issue later on. Another thing that sometimes goes unnoticed is really good house lighting production. You know, good lighting can be the difference between a concert feeling okay but kind of awkward and feeling really epic. So if you can have some cool lighting, maybe a fogger if you're equipped to do that, and someone who knows how to run that stuff, that can really take things to the next level. And another thing people maybe don't think about as often as they could is having a stage with adequate space. Now again, you know, this is not a demand, this is an ideal, but you can think your stage is really big until you start putting gear on it. You know, mic stands with big wide bases, a drum set, 2 drum sets if you're backlining, amps, house lighting equipment, all that stuff takes up square footage, and you could unwittingly be putting your artists into smaller and smaller little columns of performance if you underestimate just how much space you might need on your stage. So if you have the luxury of being able to build a new space or expand, if that's something that you're wanting to do, keep that in mind, that once you add a backstage area on and you start thinking about what are we going to be doing with that space, it might look a lot bigger than you thought it originally would. And then this is really simple but really key, and that's having a plan for changeovers if you're going to be working with multiple artists. I know I talked about this in the last list, but there's a next level of it, and that is parking. If we're going to go next level, it's having your own parking, dedicated parking, and even better than that is having dedicated separate parking for artists and their crews versus the general audience. Ideally, somewhere that is close to the loading area and the backstage area. Another great thing to ideally have is security personnel. Enough said. So here's a big one that I think sometimes goes overlooked, and that's stuff when you're doing things outdoors. So having a plan if you're working with an outdoor facility. So that means having a rain site in case it rains, and it means having a rain plan in case it starts raining in the middle of a performance. Having your staff trained on what to do if it starts raining, and having things like waterproof tarps and plastic bags that can be quickly thrown over an artist's gear to save their stuff. So that's everything I had on my list. Is there anything you think I missed in the essentials or the ideals? I would love to hear about it in my comments. Partially because even myself at the staff at our church, we're beginning to think about these things as we want to start putting on more events and doing more concerts and community type things as well. So until next time, I love you, Jesus loves you, onward and upward, and I'll see you again really soon.